Tracy, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Mike.
You've written about the impact of COVID-19 on the retail, hospitality and tourism sectors across the US. Can you please summarise some of the key stats or statistics that show the devastating impact on each of these sectors?
So in the US, retail and hospitality directly employ over 1/5 of the US workforce. So that's more than 32 million people that work in stores, hotels, bars, restaurants, etc. And that includes really high profile stuff like global hotel chains and the US television and movie industries. But the bulk of the sector is 12 million workers who work in food and beverage. And that's mostly women and minorities, racial minorities. So most of the businesses in the sector are small businesses, and 63.5% of them approximately are women and minority owned. And this is a sector that is totally reliant on congregate settings, face-to-face social interaction. And so, that is a problem in the context of a global infectious disease pandemic like the coronavirus. And so that sector has been really badly impacted by shutdowns. And roughly half of leisure and hospitality businesses have had to close or reduce their hours since the pandemic began.
You wrote about the upending of the retail sector in March. It's now September. My, how time flies when you're having fun. Can you explain what you meant by the retail bottleneck and if we've reached the other side of the bottleneck?
What's happening in the US right now is that many stores are looking at not just temporary but permanent closures. And so the retail sector is potentially passing through a bottleneck and will look very different when we do someday get to the other side of this pandemic.
Will the impact of COVID-19, such as restrictions, become greater as time goes on with compounding impacts of income loss, debt, displacement, or are we over the worst if economies keep opening up?
I think that we are through a very difficult period in the pandemic in that we now have a better understanding of how the coronavirus is spread and of what measures are effective to contain it. I think what we're struggling with is the cultural tension around public health and whether we are prepared to actually adopt the measures that have been demonstrated to be effective. So the economy will continue to suffer if we reopen in the context of an uncontained pandemic. The reality is that what's hurting businesses in the US is not closures, it's the pandemic. And if we want to help those businesses, we need to contain the pandemic.
Some states in Australia imposing tougher restrictions and keeping borders closed to protect the populations against infection. Now, is this happening in any state that you know of? I mean, I could probably think of New York getting close to it in some ways, but not the draconian restrictions that, for example, Victoria has in Australia. Maybe California has heavier restrictions than other states such as Utah. But except for those examples, do you know of any others that are very restrictive or still trying to stamp out the COVID-19 virus?
What a lot of US states are doing is they are trying to restrict the movements of people who cross state borders. So, for example, if you travel from states on a particular list to New York State and you arrive in New York State, then the New York State policy at the current moment is that you need to quarantine for 14 days before going about whatever business brought you to New York. So, that kind of quarantine period is Every state is at this point maintaining their own list of which states they are quarantining travelers from. Some states aren't quarantining at all, and some states have quite long lists that they're quarantining from because they don't want to face a setback in their progress in containing the pandemic.
Pretty sad way for humanity to live at the moment, isn't it?
Well, it is the most difficult and strict way to contain the pandemic. And, there are other measures that have been demonstrated to be effective, like, for example, wearing masks and avoiding indoor settings with poor air circulation. But, in the US, there is still not widespread consensus across different groups and geographies about some of these alternative measures. And so that doesn't leave leadership with a ton of other options for what to do.
And I just think the trust for the government in Western society is probably at an all-time low, no matter where you are. And that probably is a major problem too, because they just don't believe what the government says. So it's a rocky road ahead. And you have also the elections happening too, so that just adds fuel to the fire.
Right, and that's I want to distinguish between politics and the government, right? In terms of the point that you're making there, which I do agree with. There is a partisan component to how we govern. Both the United States and other democracies, like Australia, that use a party system, and that the partisan politics, it is polarizing. But there is also a nonpartisan component of governing, and there's a broader culture that is not as partisan as actual political elections or the legislative process, for example. And I think one of the things that we're struggling with in the United States is that trusted nonpartisan figures have not been allowed to step forward in order to lead our response to the pandemic.
You also wrote that many communities and local groups have mobilised and some businesses are changing their operations to adapt. Can you comment on how these initiatives are aiding recovery?
Well, unfortunately, I think that in the U.S. it is early days to talk about recovery. I want to start envisioning it and to start planning for it. But I think that the adaptations that many independent businesses are employing right now I would describe them as more like survival tactics than as a recovery mode. And I think what businesses are doing to survive is helpful because it lets us navigate a middle ground between a total shutdown and just an absolute stagnation of all economic activity and giving up on any attempt to contain the pandemic. So I think that the adaptations that communities and small businesses are deploying are smart and are a sign of resilience. But I think that the bottom line is that in the U.S., 45% of the adult population has experienced a loss of income since late March.
Wow.
And that is really devastating. Especially given that we are, in many places in the U.S., still attempting to recover from the 2008 recession. And places don't have, a lot of people in places don't have tremendous reserves that they can call on now to carry them through another crisis.
What about communities experiencing violence and a breakdown in law and order? Is this going to become a bigger problem with politics, dissension about police and defunding initiatives?
Well, I think that in the US, that public demonstrations are actually a really important part of the political process, and they're a part of how we decide what's really important and how we make change. That said, there are some places that are experiencing really concentrated amounts of property damage, and that will be an extra challenge for them in recovery. And, especially in certain commercial corridors in and around Minneapolis. This is something that I think is a concern. But that is one metro area in the United States, and there is no major property damage issue in the vast majority of U.S. cities right now. That is not the concern. I think the concern, both from a social perspective and from an economic perspective, is the jeopardy to health and well-being.
Do you think there'll be a long-term movement of populations out of the urban areas, and what other long-term changes will affect our cities from this pandemic?
I think that it's very unlikely that there is going to be a long-term trend away from cities. In the U.S., we already have been through a long-term period of urban population decline, the era of U.S. suburbanization. And, cities have kind of reached an equilibrium from that. And in fact, many cities' populations pre-pandemic were growing in a way that was really healthy. So I think that that was happening for powerful economic reasons. And the forces of clustering and agglomeration that create markets and that organize people and make them want to be together, those are extremely powerful forces that will continue to exist after the pandemic.
And just quickly, your thoughts on opportunity zones. One of our regular guests, Blake Christian from Holthouse, Carlin and Van Trite in Los Angeles and in Long Beach and Park City in Utah, because he loves skiing. He was talking about these opportunity zones, and from my way of thinking, it's almost a win-win for everybody. What's your thoughts?
Well, opportunity zones are potentially a big deal because it's a new kind of foregone tax revenue for the federal government that has the potential to make available multi-billions of dollars in capital for real estate and for venture capital to invest in businesses in these designated opportunity zones in the United States. But I think that it's early to call it a win-win, in part because many of the communities that have been designated as opportunity zones, I am not sure that the number one challenge those communities were facing was a lack of capital controlled by outside investors. That may be the case in some communities, but I'm not convinced that it's the case in all. And the reality is that due to some wrinkles in the opportunity zone designation process, not all opportunity zones are even located in actual low-income communities. So I think the jury's still out on exactly what the long-term impact of the Opportunity Zone program will be. And unfortunately, it's going to be hard to tell because the program has very few reporting requirements.
I think the US still an amazing place. Hopefully it gets to be more positively amazing, because it's the rest of the world looks at the US, or the Western world does anyway, and always the land of opportunity. If you put your head down and your rump up and work hard, generally you get back what you put in. Love the place, love this conversation, and would love to do more of these. Tracy, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Mike.